This 1868 portrait of a teacher and girl looks proud until you see the bookplate. The image arrived at the Tennessee State Museum as part of a larger donation, one more box in a shipment of Civil War-era artifacts from a Nashville estate. It seemed ordinary at first. A formal portrait, a white woman in dark silk standing behind a young black girl who held a school primer against her chest. The composition suggested mentorship, even affection. The kind of image used in textbooks to illustrate Reconstruction's promise of education and uplift. Until the archivist noticed the bookplate. Miriam Holt had worked as a collection specialist in Nashville for 11 years. She had cataloged daguerreotypes of soldiers, tintypes of farming families, cabinet cards commissioned by the city's wealthiest households. She knew how to read the conventions of 19th-century portraiture, how subjects were arranged to project prosperity, respectability, moral virtue. This photograph, mounted on heavy cardstock with the faint stamp of a Nashville studio in the lower corner, followed those conventions exactly. The teacher's hand rested lightly on the girl's shoulder. The girl's expression was composed, serious, her eyes meeting the camera with something that might have been pride. The primer she held was angled so the viewer could see it clearly. A spelling book, probably McGuffey's, with a marbled cover and a small bookplate pasted inside the front board. Miriam almost did not look twice. She had already logged the image as Portrait of Teacher and Student, circa 1865 to 1870 Nashville, and was reaching for the next item in the box when something made her pause. The bookplate. Under the conservation lamp she could see that the name field had been written in twice. The first inscription, in careful childish letters, read, "Property of Eliza Mays." But that name had been crossed out with a single firm stroke, and below it, in a different hand, someone had written E. Whitmore. Miriam adjusted her magnifying loupe and leaned closer. The crossing out was not careless. It was deliberate, done with the same ink as the second inscription, but clearly by an adult's hand. The child's writing remained visible beneath, the M and the Y of Mays still legible under the line that canceled them. She turned the photograph over. On the back, in faded pencil, someone had written, "Miss Adelaide Whitmore and Ward, 1868. Ward. Not student, not daughter, not even servant. Ward. Miriam set the photograph down and looked at it again with different eyes. The teacher's hand on the girl's shoulder suddenly seemed less like guidance and more like possession. The girl's composed expression now read as something else entirely. Not pride. Stillness. The stillness of someone who has learned not to move unless told. Miriam had seen thousands of old photographs. She knew how to file them, describe them, store them properly. But this one would not let her do any of those things, not yet. Because if the girl's name was Eliza Mays, and someone had taken the trouble to erase it and replace it with the teacher's surname, then what she was looking at was not a portrait of education. It was a portrait of erasure. Miriam was not the kind of archivist who trusted her instincts over evidence. She had been trained at a graduate program in public history at a university in North Carolina, spent 2 years at a county historical society in Virginia before moving to Tennessee, and had built her reputation on meticulous sourcing. When something seemed off, she did not speculate. She researched. She began with the studio stamp, J. H. Van Stavoren, Nashville. The name appeared in city directories from 1858 through 1874. A moderately successful portrait photographer who had survived the war by taking commissions from both Union officers and Confederate families, depending on who was paying. His work was competent but unremarkable. Miriam found no indication that he specialized in any particular type of subject or that he had political sympathies that would explain why he might photograph a white teacher with a black ward. Next, she turned to the estate paperwork that had accompanied the donation. The collection had come from the family of one Harold Whitmore, Jr., who had died without heirs in 2019. His great-great-aunt had been Adelaide Whitmore, born 1842 in Davidson County, Tennessee, never married, taught school in Nashville from 1866 until her death in 1901, remembered in a 1902 obituary as a devoted servant of the freedmen's cause who had taken many unfortunate children under her Christian care. The language was typical for the era, but Miriam had learned to distrust the word care when it appeared in documents about black children in white households in the years after the war. She searched the census records. In 1870, Adelaide Whitmore appeared as head of household at an address on Cherry Street in Nashville. Living with her were 2 servants, both black women in their 30s, and 3 children listed as mulatto. Their surnames were all Whitmore. Their relationship to Adelaide was listed as Ward. Miriam cross-referenced the names against the 1860 census. None of the children appeared. But in the 1860 slave schedules for Davidson County, she found an Adelaide Whitmore listed as the owner of 7 enslaved people, including 3 children under the age of 5. So Adelaide had owned enslaved children before the war. After the war, she had kept children in her household, but now they carried her name and were classified as wards. The transition from enslaver to guardian had apparently required only a change of paperwork. Miriam needed to understand how this was possible. She contacted a colleague at a law school in Knoxville, a legal historian named Professor Leonard Oakes, who specialized in the Reconstruction era in Tennessee. He agreed to meet her at the state archives the following week. Professor Oakes was a tall man in his 60s with a precise way of speaking that came from decades of teaching. When Miriam showed him the photograph and explained what she had found, he nodded slowly, as though the story was familiar. Tennessee, he explained, had passed an apprenticeship law in 1866, shortly after the end of the war. The law was ostensibly designed to protect orphaned or destitute children by placing them under the guardianship of responsible adults who would provide for their education and welfare in exchange for their labor. In practice, the law was used almost exclusively against black children. County courts could bind a black child to a white guardian if a judge determined that the child's parents were unable to support them, or if the child was found wandering, or if the parents were deemed of bad character. The standard of proof was almost non-existent. A white person's word was generally sufficient. Once bound, the child became legally obligated to serve the guardian until the age of 21. The guardian controlled where the child lived, what work they performed, whether they attended school, and even what name they used. The arrangement was called apprenticeship, but the legal framework was indistinguishable from the indenture contracts that had governed bound labor in the colonial era. And in many cases, the children who were apprenticed had been enslaved by the very families who now became their guardians. Professor Oakes explained that the practice was widespread in Tennessee and throughout the South in the years immediately after the war. Thousands of black children were separated from their parents and placed with white families under court orders. The Freedmen's Bureau tried to intervene in some cases, but local courts often ignored federal objections. By the time the practice was formally ended in the 1870s, an entire generation of black children had spent their formative years in a legal status that was slavery in everything but name. Miriam looked at the photograph again. Eliza Mays, whose name had been crossed out and replaced with Whitmore. A child who had been given a primer with her own name in it, perhaps the first thing she had ever owned, and then had that name taken away. The bookplate was not just evidence of erasure. It was the moment of erasure, captured in ink. Miriam returned to the archives with a clearer sense of what she was looking for. She requested the apprenticeship records for Davidson County from 1865 through 1870. The records were incomplete, many having been lost or destroyed over the years. But in a ledger from 1866, she found what she was looking for. On March 14, 1866, the county court had bound 4 children to Adelaide Whitmore: Eliza, age 7, James, age 5, Martha, age 4, and an infant listed only as unnamed. All 4 were described as colored orphans whose parents were unknown. The court order specified that Adelaide would provide the children with adequate food, clothing, and Christian instruction, and would teach them such trades as are suitable for their station. Miriam recognized the names: Eliza, James, Martha. These were the same children who appeared in the 1870 census as Adelaide's wards. The infant had apparently not survived, but the description of the children as orphans with unknown parents did not match what Miriam found in the Freedmen's Bureau records. A petition filed in Nashville in August 1866, just 5 months after the court order, came from a woman named Patience Mays. She was seeking the return of her 4 children, whom she identified by name: Eliza, James, Martha, and Grace. She stated that she had been enslaved by Adelaide Whitmore's father until his death in 1864, and that her children had remained with the Whitmore household after emancipation. She had not abandoned them. She had never consented to their apprenticeship. She had simply been told one day that she was free to go, but that her children were not. The petition was denied. The case file included a letter from Adelaide Whitmore stating that Patience Mays was intemperate and unreliable, and that the children were better served by remaining under Christian guardianship. The Freedmen's Bureau agent who reviewed the case noted that he had no authority to override the decision of the county court. Miriam read the petition 3 times. Patience Mays had written it herself or had dictated it to someone who wrote it for her. The spelling was inconsistent, the phrasing sometimes awkward, but the meaning was clear. She wanted her children back. She named them. She knew where they were. She was not unknown. She was not absent. She had simply been rendered invisible by a legal system that did not recognize her claim. And the name in the primer, Eliza Mays, was not the name the court had given the child. It was the name her mother had given her, the name she had written in her own book, in her own hand, before someone decided that she belonged to someone else. Miriam knew she needed to see the places where this story had unfolded. She drove to the address on Cherry Street where Adelaide Whitmore had lived in 1870. The neighborhood had changed completely. The original houses were gone, replaced by a strip mall and a parking lot. Nothing remained of the physical space where Eliza Mays had lived as a child, but the county courthouse in Nashville still held records. Miriam spent 3 days in the archives there, pulling deed books, probate files, and guardianship records. She found more petitions from black parents seeking the return of apprenticed children. Most had been denied. A few had succeeded, usually only when the Freedmen's Bureau brought significant pressure to bear. But even in successful cases, the children had often spent years in white households by the time they were returned. Professor Oakes connected Miriam with another expert, a historian named Dr. Vanessa Pryor, who taught at a university in Memphis and had spent years researching post-emancipation labor systems in the South. Dr. Pryor explained that the apprenticeship laws were part of a broader strategy to maintain control over black labor after slavery. The laws allowed white families to claim the labor of black children without paying wages, while simultaneously depriving black families of the children's labor and companionship. It was not just an economic arrangement, it was a systematic assault on black family structures. Dr. Pryor had documented cases where apprenticed children were prohibited from seeing their parents, punished for speaking their birth names, and forced to use the surnames of their guardians. The renaming was not incidental. It was a legal requirement in some jurisdictions and a common practice in others. A child who bore her mother's name was a child who remembered where she came from. A child renamed for her guardian was a child whose origins had been officially erased. The bookplate in Eliza's primer captured exactly this transformation, her mother's name crossed out, her guardian's name written beneath, the document of her identity altered to reflect a legal fiction. Dr. Pryor also pointed Miriam toward records that Adelaide Whitmore's defenders would not have wanted examined. In 1869, a complaint had been filed with the Freedmen's Bureau alleging that Adelaide was working her wards excessively and failing to provide them with adequate education. The complaint came from a black church in Nashville, whose pastor had spoken with several members of the congregation who knew the Mays children. The Bureau investigated and found that while the children did attend school, they also performed substantial domestic labor, including cooking, cleaning, and laundry. Adelaide was warned, but not sanctioned. The case was closed. Miriam tracked down what had happened to the children after 1870. The census records showed that Eliza remained in Adelaide's household through 1880, when she would have been 21 and thus released from her apprenticeship. After that, she disappeared from Nashville records entirely. James appeared in Memphis in 1890, working as a laborer. Martha had died in 1878 at age 16. The cause listed in the county death records was consumption, but no medical records survived. What about Patience Mays, the mother? Miriam searched for years without finding her. No death record in Nashville, no marriage record, no census entry after 1866. She had filed her petition, been denied, and then vanished from the documentary record. Perhaps she had moved away. Perhaps she had died. Perhaps she had simply stopped appearing in records kept by people who did not consider her worth documenting. But she had existed. She had fought. She had named her children and tried to claim them. And someone, probably Adelaide herself, had taken Eliza's primer and crossed out the name that connected the girl to her mother. Miriam brought her findings to the museum's acquisitions committee. She had prepared a detailed memo explaining the photograph's provenance, the legal context of apprenticeship, and the evidence connecting the image to the erasure of Eliza Mays's identity. She recommended that the museum accept the photograph into the collection, but revise the descriptive label to reflect what the image actually showed. The meeting did not go as she had hoped. The committee chair, a longtime donor whose family had contributed significantly to the museum's endowment, listened to Miriam's presentation with visible discomfort. When she finished, he asked whether she was suggesting that Adelaide Whitmore had done something wrong. Miriam said that the evidence showed Adelaide had obtained legal control over children who had living parents, had changed their names, and had benefited from their labor until they reached adulthood. Whether that constituted wrongdoing was a matter of interpretation. But the photograph could not be accurately described as a portrait of a teacher and student. It was a portrait of a guardian and a legally bound child, and the bookplate showed the moment when the child's original identity was erased. Another committee member, the museum's development director, pointed out that the Whitmore family had donated the collection in good faith. The family remembered Adelaide as a philanthropist and educator. Reframing the photograph as evidence of exploitation would be uncomfortable for the descendants and could affect the museum's relationship with other potential donors. Miriam replied that the museum's mission was to preserve and interpret history accurately. If accuracy was uncomfortable, that was not a reason to avoid it. The committee debated for nearly an hour. Several members supported Miriam's interpretation. Others worried about public reaction, about accusations of presentism, about imposing modern moral standards on historical figures. The development director suggested that the photograph could be displayed with a neutral description that mentioned the apprenticeship system without characterizing it as harmful. Dr. Pryor, whom Miriam had invited to attend the meeting as an outside expert, spoke last. She noted that the museum already displayed artifacts related to slavery with clear explanatory context. No one suggested that those displays should be neutral. The apprenticeship system was a continuation of slavery by legal means, and the photograph documented a specific instance of that system in action. The child in the image had a name, a mother, and a story. Refusing to tell that story was not neutrality. It was a choice to continue the erasure that Adelaide Whitmore had begun. The committee voted to accept the photograph with the revised interpretation. The decision was not unanimous, but it passed. The exhibition opened 8 months later. The photograph was displayed in a gallery devoted to the Reconstruction era, alongside other artifacts documenting the struggles of formerly enslaved people to build free lives in Tennessee. The label read, Portrait of Adelaide Whitmore and Eliza Mays, 1868. Eliza was legally bound to Adelaide under Tennessee's apprenticeship law after emancipation. The bookplate inside the primer shows Eliza's original name, given by her mother, Patience Mays, crossed out and replaced with her guardian's surname. Thousands of black children across the South were subjected to similar arrangements, which allowed white families to continue controlling their labor and erasing their family connections. Beside the photograph, the museum displayed a copy of Patience Mays's 1866 petition, along with a brief explanation of its contents. The petition was the only surviving record of Patience's voice, the only document that showed she had tried to reclaim her children. Miriam had also contacted descendants of James Mays, Eliza's brother, who had continued the family name in Memphis. A great-granddaughter named Dorothy came to the exhibition opening. She stood in front of the photograph for a long time without speaking. When Miriam approached her, she said quietly that her grandfather had never talked about his childhood. He had told his children that the past was too painful to revisit, but he had also insisted that they keep the name Mays. He had told them it was their mother's name, their real name. Dorothy did not know what had happened to Eliza after 1880. Family lore said she had moved north, maybe to Chicago or Ohio. but no one knew for certain. The trail had gone cold more than a century ago. Still, seeing her name restored, written in the label beside the photograph, mattered. For more than 150 years, the image had been understood as a portrait of a generous white teacher and her grateful black student. Now it would be understood as something else, a record of legal theft, a child whose name was taken, a mother who fought and lost. The photograph, displayed now with its true context, serves as evidence of a system designed to be invisible. Apprenticeship laws were written to sound benevolent. They spoke of protection, care, Christian instruction, but their purpose was to preserve the labor arrangements of slavery after slavery had been abolished. The children bound under these laws were not orphans, they were stolen. Their names were changed not to give them new identities, but to sever them from old ones. Eliza Mays learned to write her own name in a primer that someone gave her, perhaps as a kindness, perhaps as a tool of instruction. She wrote, "Property of Eliza Mays," in the space provided, claiming herself even as the law said she belonged to someone else. And then an adult hand crossed out that claim and wrote a different name, the name of the woman who controlled her labor and her future. The photograph captured a moment meant to look like progress, a teacher and student, education for the freed people, the promise of reconstruction. But look at the bookplate, at the careful child's writing, at the firm adult stroke that canceled it, and you see something else entirely. You see a system that turned liberation into a new form of captivity, that transformed slavery into apprenticeship, that erased parents and renamed children. Thousands of similar photographs exist in archives, family albums, and museum collections across the South. Many show arrangements that look benign on the surface, white families with black children positioned to suggest affection, gratitude, or religious instruction. Most of those photographs have never been examined the way Miriam examined this one. The names on the backs, if names exist at all, are the names given by guardians, not by parents. The stories they were originally meant to tell are stories of white generosity and black improvement. But the details, if you look closely enough, tell different stories. A child's hand reaching for something just outside the frame, a piece of paper folded small and hidden in a pocket, an expression that does not match the composition, a name written, then crossed out. These details do not explain themselves. They require someone willing to look, to ask questions, to follow the paper trail through archives and courthouses and church basements until the official story cracks and something else shows through. Not the story that the photographer was paid to capture, not the story that the family wanted preserved, but the story of the person who had no say in how she would be remembered. Eliza Mays was 7 years old when she was bound to Adelaide Whitmore. She was 21 when she was finally released. For 14 years, she carried a name that was not hers, performed labor she was not paid for, and was separated from a mother who had tried to bring her home. What happened to her after 1880, no one knows, but in 1868, someone put a primer in her hands, and she wrote her real name in it. She wrote, Eliza Mays. And for more than a century and a half, that name survived, hidden under a line of ink, waiting for someone to look closely enough to find it. The next time you see an old photograph of a white adult and a black child, posed carefully in a studio with props arranged to suggest education or care or Christian charity, ask yourself whose story the image was meant to tell. And then ask yourself whose story it actually tells. If you look at the hands, the eyes, the objects, the names. Because the photograph will never tell you the truth on its own. The truth is in the details that someone thought they could erase but could not. The truth is waiting to be read if you are willing to do the reading.